Hello, my name's Majia Nadesan, and this is my presentation, Authoritarian Affect and the Rise of Neo-Mercantile Government. Here's a little bit about me. My research explores biopolitics. That is, it explores the ethics and politics of the governance of life in liberal democratic societies. In particular, I'm interested in the ways in which risks are represented and managed with respect to the government of life. And in terms of this risk management, I address how governmental and intergovernmental agencies manage risk, how corporations represent and manage risk, and how scientific experts represent and manage risk. The argument made in this presentation is that regime of government that we have been living in for the last 30, 40 years, neoliberal government, is fracturing. And its fracturing is resulting in the rise of authoritarian affect, emotional economies, and also a new regime of government, what I call neo-mercantile governmentality, is also arising. The steps in the argument begin with the idea that neoliberal governance, which was launched in the late 1970s, it produces crises because its logic prioritizes extraction, the sort of financial froth, and relies on risky, innovative technologies, which are often deployed at a distance. And so wealth creation occurs through credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations and other kinds of sort of vacuous financial instruments that allow the sort of scalping of value from basic labor or commodities. The crises that are result from these sort of risky, innovative technologies, they have the effect of externalizing the cost, shifting the cost to the average person. And we saw that with the 2007 financial crisis, the 2011 Fukushima nuclear crisis, and the contemporary COVID crisis. And this kind of externalization of the risks from the crises produce social resistance and also, unfortunately, increasing emotional or affective support for authoritarianism. The very efforts to kind of reassert control over the unraveling neoliberal assemblages also increase the authoritarianism in our society, and I'll give some examples. Extraction, what is it? For me, extraction is a formal relationship which is actualized in distinct ways, is historicized across historical epochs. Extraction was a principle of social relationships before capitalism, but under capitalism, extraction focuses on surplus labor. That is the sort of site of extraction. And we see that this kind of focus of extraction on labor remains sort of the basic logic throughout early and mid 20th century capitalism. However, the extractive relationships become even more virtual and disconnected, although still rooted in labor, more disconnected from labor in time and space under neoliberal capitalism, as ever more sort of vacuous financial contracts and relationships were generated in order to extract or scalp value. We have then different expressions of extractive relationships across these different forms of capitalism, beginning with early neo-mercantile kind of capitalism, which was characterized by an ideology of laissez-faire, but an imperial state. We have mid-20th century Keynesian regulated capitalism that increasingly uses more advanced automation to extract value from labor, but moves towards financialization as labor becomes more costly. We have, under this form of capitalism, the modern bureaucratic state that launches biopolitics to cultivate the welfare of the population, but only in relation to the imperatives of economy and national security thought within Cold War contexts. And then we have the rise of neoliberal capitalism in the 70s, the deregulation of rules that prevented extractive excess in financial economies. We have accelerated automation and financialization as the population ceases to become the source of value, not that it ceases altogether, but its importance is reduced. And we have the rise of international governance to enable neoliberal flows that encourage government at a distance but also invoke repressive force. And the contradictions across neoliberal governance have produced great shocks for the population that are giving rise to the new regime of late capitalist dissolution, neo-mercantilism, that I describe in subsequent slides. Extraction in the neoliberal epoch has been fraught with crises, and those crises have laid bare inequalities of power relations, access to resources, decision-making power that are contradictory to the principles of neoliberal inclusivity. And there are many scholars who have documented these developments. I'm quite fond of Saskia Sassen's work and the ways in which she has charted how today's dominant geographies are geographies of extraction that are ruled not so much by physical borders, but rather by financial markets. And here you can see an article that where she discusses the impacts on inequalities. The neoliberal, innovative, and risky financial technologies that were developed to accelerate extraction and to separate it from labor have resulted in the greatest consolidation of wealth since the 1930s. And this one study, the Network of Global Corporate Control, which I highly recommend, documents how this has resulted in 1,300 corporations basically controlling 60% of global revenues and a super entity of 147 financial corporations essentially controlling 40% of the entire network, and 734 top holders of stock accumulate 80% of the control over the value of all transnational corporations. So network control is even more unequally distributed than wealth. And the top-ranked actors hold a control 10 times bigger than what would be expected based on their wealth alone over the global economy. So the neoliberal innovative technologies have created unprecedented consolidation of wealth and control. So some basic principles of neoliberal extraction include the financialization of wealth, consolidated but globally dispersed ownership and control of wealth, centralized decision-making homogenized around extractive and externalizing logics, innovation around extractive technologies, hubris and failures of transparency with respect to the risks of these innovative technologies, regulatory capture of the modern state, and also accelerating and irrational ecosystem destruction, all of which are amplifying crises. Liberal democratic capitalism privileges self-ownership, individual liberty, and a free market. However, liberal democratic capitalism across all of the epochs described has always been simultaneously haunted by totalitarianism. Repressive policing, the military state under colonialism, and then under the Cold War, and then in the context of enforcing globalization. These expressions of authoritarian or totalitarian control have always coexisted with liberal democratic institutions, and for this reason totalitarianism haunts liberal democratic society. Agamben, the Italian philosopher, has identified the ways in which these hauntings are enabled through exclusionary principles latent within liberal philosophy and law and policy, which allow and legitimize consolidations and executions of power that would otherwise belie liberal sensibilities. For example, exclusions for women, children, people of color having equal rights. Moreover, in addition to these sort of exclusionary principles, threats to liberal principles of freedom are generated endogenously within liberal democratic societies as there are nostalgic yearnings for more authoritarian paths. And we see this with the rise of what I have described in previous work as neoconservative governmentalities or logics of governments that embrace exclusion, embrace walls following Wendy Brown, while also creating nationalistic views of racialized origins and destinies in the United States. We see that with the rise of white supremacist movements. The contradictions of neoliberal capitalism have generated crises that are lending support, the conditions of possibility for the reemergence of mercantile capitalism. And you can look at the characteristics of traditional mercantile capitalism emerging in the 1600s through the late 1800s. And I will, on the next slide, discuss the characteristics of contemporary neo-mercantile capitalism. The contradictions of neoliberal governance, coupled with the crises produced, are resulting in increasing moves towards neo-mercantilism, a logic of government that I see as replacing neoliberalism. Foucault offers some insights about the mercantile sovereign that are helpful in understanding the evolution of neo-mercantile capitalism that I see occurring now. Foucault argued that the mercantile sovereign was an architect of disciplined space, a regulator of a milieu by making possible and guaranteeing circulations while simultaneously creating enclosures that govern dangerous flows. Foucault argued that the logic of government that emerged under state mercantilism involved a superimposition of the state of sovereignty, the territorial state, and the commercial state. And the problem of government was maximum economic development through commerce within a rigid system of sovereignty, as distinct and differentiated from the promotion of circulation under neoliberal capitalism. Neo-mercantile capitalism can be distinguished from neoliberal capitalism in that rather than embracing biopolitics, neo-mercantile capitalism is much more likely to embrace thanatopolitics. And the reason why is that labor has ceased to be the source of value. Remember, under early liberal capitalism, the wealth of nations is the productive capacity of the population. However, as extractive processes become ever more vacuous, ever more derivative in terms of creation of value, the underlying contribution of labor itself ceases to have relevance, and therefore the population no longer is construed within a biopolitics of optimization, but rather instead with a thanatopolitics of death, where the population is not governed in terms of efforts to administer life, but rather efforts to not necessarily administer death, but efforts to dispose of the state's responsibility for administering life, a letting die. The displacement of biopolitics by thanatopolitics is an ongoing process. However, endogenous and exogenous shocks exacerbate and amplify that process. And the current coronavirus represents both an endogenous and an exogenous shock. It's an exogenous shock in the sense that it is a virus that is impacting the population, but it's endogenous because it exacerbates alienation. It exacerbates the automation process that is occurring as labor loses value as the source of wealth creation. It is exacerbating existing tensions within the population. We can see in the policy response to the coronavirus that the economy and the logic of government shaping its stewardship have shifted away from a valuation of the population. And we see this in the manipulation of data and the essential kind of dropping of any kind of social protocols to prevent viral contagion, as literally the population is rendered disposable. Neo-mercantilism, authoritarian affect, and zombification. So we have a situation where the fractures of the neoliberal global system, coupled with the exogenous and endogenous shocks produced by COVID-19, are resulting in growing social alienation, accelerated automation, furthering inequalities in a context of increasingly chronically sick populations, occurring at the point at which society is reflecting upon its resource limits. And in the convergence of these factors, we have what I describe and illustrate here as a kind of zombification. The thanatopolitics holds publics as essentially walking dead. They are zombified. And this, of course, poses very significant problems for liberal democratic societies. Mercantilism produced war between and among nations. Neo-Mercantilism will also produce war between, within, and among nations. As a result of the extractive principle and as a result of the devaluation of the population. The time is now for alternative governance, requiring imagining alternative, sustainable ways of living with resources distributed, produced, and governed using alternative, more sustainable logics, and adopting new biopolitics that are freed from the hierarchical and immunological aspects of biopolitics under capitalism. The time is now. We're running out.